All right, you ready to do this?
Sounds like a plan.
All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Guy McPherson here with my guest. Very excited to have as my guest, PJ Lewis. PJ, welcome.
Thank you so much.
All right. So PJ is a registered clinical and Canadian certified counselor, as well as the clinical director of the DBT Center of the Fraser Valley in Canada. PG has particular expertise in providing individual, group, and family treatment to high-risk youth and families experiencing concerns such as suicidality, self-harm, emotional dysregulation, impulsivity, depression, anxiety, among other things. PJ also has specialized training in DBT, Dialectical Behaviour Therapy, integrating trauma treatment into DBT, and has extensive background in DBT program implementation for the youths and adults in government agencies and community services, school boards, and educational institutions. So DBT is huge. Before we get into that, PJ, once again, thank you so much for being here, and share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are now.
So originally, I was the kind of a novelty from my family. I was born on the west coast of Canada in Vancouver, British Columbia, and the entire rest of my family is from the east coast of Canada in Newfoundland. So
Okay.
yeah, and I still find myself on the west coast. I'm out here just a little bit further east in Abbotsford in the beautiful Fraser Valley here in British Columbia.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So interesting background. Your bio is very intriguing to me because in a way it's similar to some of my experience. But let's get into it here. How did you get into this field and working with kids in this population?
You know, it's kind of interesting because I didn't set out to be a therapist. My background, my undergraduate studies began in kinesiology, and I was kind of heading the medicine route, and did some volunteer work in a hospital and really enjoyed the science and the medical side of things, but didn't really love my experience where I felt that, people were kind of numbers and cogs in a wheel and whatnot. And I was really craving a much more personalized and meaningful interaction with folks, and really helping them to meet where they're at. And spent a few years trying to figure things out, working in the nonprofit world and all the rest of it, and then eventually came back to school thinking I was going to be a teacher. And I had a wonderful professor challenge me, and I was taking an elective course in the counseling department, mostly just out of pure curiosity and interest. And she said, you know what, I think you got a little bit of a knack for this. And I would challenge you to consider becoming a therapist. And I thought she was insane. Because at that time I was like, grad school, two kids under two,
Oh, wow.
no way. Like,
Okay.
and so but one thing led to another, and my wife and I decided to take the risk and make the application. And long story short, I couldn't imagine doing anything different. And then got out into the field and found that I had a certain natural comfort or aptitude working with both youth, adults, families in really high risk populations with really co-occurring complexities in their life. And I didn't expect that. And yet was welcoming of being able to work with folks who often, in my experience, a lot of other people who I was going to school with or were talking to were just like, oh, I don't like working with that population.
Mm-hmm.
That scares me, or I don't feel like I can help them.
Well, first of all, that's fascinating. Your background's fascinating. But let's, if we could, put a little magnifying glass over what you said about having an affinity for people, kids, and families who are in that position, high risk. Talk more about that. What do you feel it is about you? And yeah.
You know, I think some of it was almost stumbling into it by accident. I had a curiosity around, how is it that connecting to people and how people connect to each other is really protective for them and really helps them stay engaged in life, in society, in their families, and in those circles. And so some of my own, research in grad school was starting to focus around that and looking at relational connections and disconnections that helped people overcome feeling suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
And there was just again and again, both in the research and in my own research, things kept pointing back to life just seems more livable when there's meaningful, caring people that you're connected to as a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of these children, youth, and adults that I started working with, they either felt like they were or actually were quite cut off from a lot of those resources. And so to have the honor of working with them, to journey alongside of them, to help them build a life worth living and make some of those connections, was something that it just felt like such an honor to me to be able to be a part of that.
That's
And
awesome.
I kept working there.
That's awesome. So what do you, so you're, again, you're clinical director at this facility in Canada. What do you do specifically there at the center?
Okay. So in our center, we kind of have two branches. We have a general counseling and mental health center where we can work with children, youth, adults, families to help meet general goals, working with, things like depression and anxiety. And probably a big part of where our work has expanded in these last little while has been to open a branch for specifically around DBT and DBT treatment. We had lots of experience in the past working in public sector for that, and now to bring that to the general public in through the private sector clinic, where we're able to provide DBT treatment to children, youth, adults, families who are experiencing a lot of those co-occurring complexities and those big emotional fluctuations that are really getting in the way of helping them find their life worth living.
Is this inpatient or outpatient or both?
We're outpatient in the
Okay.
community, and that's actually one of the great focuses of DBT as a treatment is we want to help people stay in their lives, in their communities, in their families, even though a lot of the things they're struggling with might actually wind them up in hospital without, the kind of work that we're able to do in the community.
Right, right. So, um, you got me going here. So when someone, let's say a kid walks into your treatment program, walk us through what their treatment might look like.
Mm.
Obviously, it's going to be different for different people, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah.
If we were to even just look kind of in broad strokes through a DBT lens, it starts like everything with that first phone call, that first contact, and the therapy really does start then from that first point of contact and that first grasp at forging a relationship to work together, and then from there an intake interview to really walk with a person through what is happening in your life, what problems are getting in the way, and how are we going to help you to find a life that's worth living for you. Because even though DBT works with a lot of life-threatening types of behaviors and conditions that people are experiencing, it's not a suicide prevention program. It's not just to stop doing these dangerous things. It's if we can have a life with less suffering, more meaning, and a sense of worth to it, then those solutions will become less necessary. And we can find a way through the despair and the suffering in a meaningful way. And so that starts looking like, there's really four big pieces that we offer folks, and these things all happen at the same time: individual structured therapy on a weekly basis, skills training, usually in a group format for our youth. We do involve their caregivers in that
Mm-hmm.
as well, so they're all learning those same skills and strategies. We also offer coaching outside the therapy sessions, because one of the things we know is really hard is taking effective things that we're learning in therapy and actually using them out in our real
Yep.
life. And then something that may be less obvious rather to the client is that we as DBT therapists, we meet every week because working with really, high risk populations is hard work and can be stressful. And so we help to take care of each other and help each other to improve in our work by meeting and supporting each other regularly as well.
Oh, that sounds awesome. One of the facilities I used to work at when I was in California, we were assessing and treating young kids who were showing early signs of psychosis. And a lot of our treatment was family, their family group therapy. And it was vital. So were you guys working with the family also?
You
Yeah,
bet.
yeah.
And so parent coaching and parent involvement in the skills training is a key part of our adolescent DBT programs.
Yeah. Let me ask you, PJ, when you first started doing this, I mean, it sounded like you hit the ground running, but I kind of want to get an idea here of something, how you approach this work when you first started out to where you are now. What was it like for you when you just started working with kids who were suicidal?
Hmm. Yeah, it's on one hand, I didn't find it as terrifying as some of my colleagues did. I found just when you connect with a real person in a real way, there's something about that human to human connection that was just normal, even in those really dangerous circumstances. Though at the same time, it can be really intimidating working with families especially where a youth is experiencing a number of different stressors and a number of really high risk behaviors, and usually through no fault of their own, a lack of protection and support.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember very particularly working with one young lady and, several trips to hospital, several attempts on her own life, lots of non-suicidal self-injury, substance use, history in foster care, you name it. You paint the picture of one of the more horrific childhoods you could imagine, and it was probably a part of her history.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember sitting with her, and it was a little bit daunting to think, I'm the fourth therapist she's seen. And in her report, nothing has worked so far. And now here I am trying to say, now you got to do therapy again and try this all over again. And there was something in that moment that I don't know if it was a moment of wisdom or luck or both, when I just paused and said, I don't blame you for being skeptical about this whole thing working, because it hasn't worked for you before. And I could imagine you're feeling entirely hopeless. And how is this going to be any different? And she's like, yeah, absolutely. I said, you know what? We didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to get out of here overnight, but are you willing to give it a try? And I can carry some hope for you until you're able to carry it for yourself again.
Wow. PJ, you're doing it, man.
And I don't know. And it was just like, that was a moment where she's like, you know what? I'll give this another session.
That's
And I'm like,
amazing.
that's our foot in the door.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Yeah.
beautiful, man. That's just like you're just being real. You're not being a friggin' therapist. You're not being a counselor. You're just being a human being, like you're saying. And that's that's magic. It seems so simple though, right?
Right. Yeah.
But
And yet we complicate it.
and yet we complicate things. I had this very similar experiences, but that's so beautiful. What was that earlier on for you, or when was that
That
in
was
your?
pretty early. That was like
Okay.
in my first, I would say, year or two as a therapist post grad school, and having some experience working, with this client population and in a few different settings, but at the same time, still really hadn't fully hit my stride. And I remember this client was particularly memorable for me because not only was it a lot of learning for me, but I really, through my work with this particular young woman, noticed that something that I had a bit of a cognitive awareness of, but really hadn't encountered in clinical practice, is how significantly trauma and trauma history overlaps with the clusters of symptoms that generally move people towards considering DBT as a possible treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's, like I said, an intellectual assent to this, and the stats show us that there's a big overlap. But I was in a position where I um, had an interesting experience in my early training where I had a wonderful supervisor, but she also kind of almost scared me a little bit because she talked so passionately about her work and working in the trauma field and about how you needed special skills and training and competency, and I fully agreed with her. But I almost swung to the other side of the pendulum where I said, okay, I will recognize trauma, I will be trauma informed, but I'm not fully trauma trained. Therefore, I almost became something that we will recognize, but we will not talk about. And that almost actually, in fact, it did get in the way of me effectively helping this client.
Mm-hmm.
She had trauma in her history, and we worked on, her suicidality and her self-harm and her substance use and all these other things. And yet the suicidal thoughts still kept coming up. And and one day working with my team, I was saying, guys, I just don't get why, we can't get past this strong, pervasive urge for suicide. She's got skills, she's got strategies, she's used so many of these things to effectively do so many meaningful things in her life, and yet she hasn't quite found her life worth living yet. And one of my colleagues challenged me. They said, well, when she's thinking about dying, what is she not thinking about? And I paused and I said, well, I don't know. And they're like, just think about it. Think about what you know about this client and what is, because this is probably serving a function for her. It's probably meeting a need for her. And then it dawned on me. I'm like, oh my gosh. She keeps talking about or mentioned early on in our work together that there were a few things that happened to her in her past that she just doesn't want to talk about. And I'm like, I bet you when she's thinking about dying, she's not thinking about those things. And my respect for her not wanting to talk about her trauma was actually getting in the way of helping her deal with her trauma. And that was a real wake-up call for me that I need to get the skills and the training to incorporate trauma work into our work in DBT.
Okay. Say that again. Your respect for her. You said my respect for her not wanting to talk about her trauma was getting in the way of working through her trauma.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, for me, it was this, on the surface, kind of hey, I want to work within my scope of practice. I'm not a trained trauma therapist, so I don't want to open up something that I can't,
Right.
actually help you process and work through. And I think that was, there was goodness in that. It's ethical
Right.
practice. And
Right.
at the same time, I wasn't actually able to help this client, with this particular problem. And that was getting in the way
Right. Right.
of her actually getting to the goal that she wanted in treatment. And that was, finding a place where she didn't want to have these urges towards suicide happening all the time, weekly,
Mm-hmm.
daily in her life.
Mm-hmm.
So that for me, that was a big wake up call. Is it's not good enough to just help people with skills and strategies in order to help with all of these things that are going on in their life. If they've experienced trauma, I've also got to get the skills and the training to be able to incorporate these two things together,
Mm-hmm.
because these things go so hand in hand for so many people.
Mm-hmm. Getting back to that amazing moment you were sharing with that woman, and it was just so beautiful. You were talking about I forget what you specifically you shared, but it was just you were relating to her on just in such in a human way. When I said it seems so easy, what do you feel it takes for a therapist or counselor or whomever to be in the moment like that, to be willing to do that, to be able to do that? Because it seems to me that it's very easy to, go into a session thinking about page 22 of some great book you're reading that you want to have a great technique that you want to implement. But this other part What are your thoughts on this, PJ?
It wasn't easy to arrive at that willingness to have an appropriate amount of vulnerability and transparency in therapy. In fact, I had one clinical supervisor who helped me work through this, and she said, you're working really hard to have, the skills and the strategies and the techniques. She's like, but are you just being real and trusting your gut?
Mm.
And I'm just like, no, that's terrifying. I'm like, what if I'm wrong? Right? And she's just like, that's your growth curve. She's like, that's what you need to do. You need to start pushing yourself into that place and trust that you're reading those nonverbal things and you're processing that information. And that's giving you important information that you need to trust in order to just be a real human in
Mm-hmm.
the room with the other person and less consumed about doing the right thing or using the right technique.
Right, right.
That took a lot of practice and supervision
I
and
yeah, I was
on my own part being willing to fail.
yeah, and the fear maybe behind that. I was so consumed with that early on for me. I felt like I needed to have the right answer, and if I didn't have the right answer, I needed to get the right answer, and it was getting in the way of exactly what you're talking about. As clinical director, how do you model that for the people who are working with you?
I think one of the ways that we do that, so we as a team of therapists, like I was mentioning, part of our model is to meet as a team weekly. And in that moment, in those times when we're together, we don't bring title into the room. I'm not the clinical director. My partner isn't the director of training. You aren't just an associate. We're equals. And we're here and all of the clients that we work with are our clients. Not your client, not my client, our client. And so part of that is just being real and honest. I'm just as likely to bring up and model bringing up, what am I struggling with? What am I failing at? How am I getting stuck? And with all of the people that I work with, regardless of whether they're someone who just came out of grad school and joined us a week ago, or whether it's somebody who's, my senior in experience, we're all in this together. We're all equal. And to be able to just be honest about that, and we're all helping each other get better. And we've all got some wisdom to contribute here, and I want to hear that.
Mm-hmm. What are you seeing in terms of how this pandemic is impacting the people you're seeing?
It is certainly having an enormous impact. On one hand, we're seeing, on a clinical level, we're seeing, increased incidences of anxiety, depression, high risk behaviors like self harm and suicidality. But I think even on a practical level, when clients are coming in the door, they're fatigued, they're tired. And they've often been cut off for a number of complicated reasons from the few things that they did find life-giving. Being able to visit family, being able to do the sorts of activities that are rejuvenating and forms of self-care for themselves. And so I think navigating the pandemic has, for a lot of our clientele, has made it challenging to kind of keep up the stamina of doing the skillful things they need to do to keep themselves in a good place. And they're coming often through the door exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going, like, I don't know, I'm doing all the right things and I'm feeling worse and I can't do the things that I used to do. It's starting to feel a bit hopeless. And so being able to then, hey, I'm with you. These are tough times, and and we're in it together.
Right, right. Are clients coming to you folks once a week, or how many times?
Typically, yeah.
Okay.
So folks who are engaging in the comprehensive DBT program are usually coming in once a week with us. And in our general clinic side, we have other clients that with other concerns who are coming in less frequently or at different intervals. But folks in our DBT treatment side are coming through weekly for sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So let's before we kind of wind down, or as we wind down here, I want to have you share an early clinical error,
Hmm.
what you learned from it.
Yeah. I think probably the biggest error that I can remember making was with one young man that I was working with, and he came in, and I was so concerned with building, rapport and having a clinical alliance, and not offending him so that he'll stay in treatment. And yes, so he'll stay in treatment, but also, that little nagging part of what some of us experience of like, well, I don't want my client to hate me either,
Mhm.
and and he came in and he started telling me about his week, and he started telling me about how horrible he was feeling. And I remember, even seeing some of, he was tracking some of his, things that he was paying attention to, like his taking of medication or his urges for self-harm. He was tracking those things on a little card, and he brought that in and showed me, and I saw a few blanks on the card, which was very unusual for him. He was a very conscientious man. And I looked at his card and I saw how down he was feeling. And what I did is I followed my urge to want to comfort him. And so, well, how are you going? How are you feeling now? And okay, we can get through this. And I was very encouraging and warm with him. And what I didn't do was ask him about, some of the more difficult things. And I didn't look at those blanks on that card where he was tracking things. And some of the things that were blank were around his taking of medication that he was prescribed, and around his whether or not he acted on some of his urges for self-harm. And and that was a mistake because I didn't ask him. And he was in a place where I found out after the fact that he was hoarding up his medication.
Mm,
He was feeling really desperate. And 2 days after we met, he ended up in hospital with an overdose.
mm.
And um, that was a terrifying moment for me. I failed as a therapist. I didn't do due diligence in looking at those things and asking those questions. I was so concerned with comforting that I missed this red flag of risk.
You
That
didn't
was,
ask about those things because you didn't want to what open up some Pandora's box or get
yeah, I
him
was just like,
mad?
he's already had such a bad week. Maybe he didn't.
Right.
Maybe he didn't fill those things in for a reason. So why would I
Mm,
want to add to that? Why
right.
would I want to stress him out in his therapy session? Were
Yeah.
the thoughts that I was having at the time.
Yeah.
And from that mistake, I was just like, you know what? Sometimes the most caring thing I can do
Mhm.
for a client is to ask those tough questions. In DBT terms, we talk about that as going where angels fear to tread,
Mhm.
and that's the ground that I need to walk with my clients. And that's that mistake. Thank goodness he made a full recovery and returned to therapy. And not only did I never make that mistake again with him, but again with other clients. Sometimes it takes taking that risk and going to those scary places in order to meet the client just where they're at in that
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah. Man, thanks for sharing that. That's awesome. All right, PJ, as we close down here, how about a go-to book recommendation, whether trauma related or not, or DBT related or not?
Yeah, I think if you want a great read in the DBT world, even if you don't like, if you don't start by reading, the clinical textbooks and whatnot, but Marsha Linehan put out a memoir earlier this year, Building a Life Worth Living, and it's a great read and really lets you in to her own experience in the developing of the treatment and her own lived experience. And I was both, touched, moved, and motivated in reading it. And I highly recommend it. And when it comes into the treatment world of how do we incorporate trauma into our work in therapy and into DBT and whatnot, even though it's not a book yet, but Melanie Harnett has published some wonderful studies in the DBT world about how to integrate PTSD treatment into DBT, and some of our own work. We haven't published anything yet, but we're in progress, is how to incorporate other forms of trauma therapy into working with the population who we're doing DBT treatment with. And so highly recommend anything you can get your hands on in those areas.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. I'll have those linked up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. PJ, man, awesome meeting you and awesome having you on here. And I really just appreciate your openness and your humanness. I love it. I love it. Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks so much. It's been an honor being here.
All right, man. We'll be in touch. Take care.
Take care.